Hey there, Gianni here, live at XRWA. Well, it's probably not going to be live by the time you watch this. It might even be in the past. We were here at the convention looking at augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, all of those fun realities in reality here in Perth. And this is a talk that we did live called Adventures in Writing for Interactive and Games. Starring a collection of different perspectives of people who write for interactive narratives. Now, as always, every episode of Pixel Sift is proudly supported by Murdoch University. Murdoch University School of Arts has supported Pixel Sift since day one, and without their help, we wouldn't have been able to make hundreds of Pixel Sift episodes. So if you're interested in getting a creative degree that combines multidisciplinary skills like maybe filmmaking, maybe game design, maybe you want to be a journalist or a podcaster, or maybe you even want to have your own Twitch channel, you should check out what's available at Murdoch University in the School of Arts. So murdoch.edu.au/arts is the address to go to, or you can search for Murdoch University on the internet. Pixel Sift. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Gianni. I am executive producer and host of a podcast called Pixel Sift. We look at people who are creative and we ask the question as why do they create and what drives them. And part of the reason we've got you here today, thank you for all coming down, is to talk about writing for an interactive medium and how that sort of compares and contrasts to other writing forms. We've got a great number of creators here for you today. Starting on my right here, I've got Alan Butler, who's a visual artist from Dublin. Anthony Sweet, who is a writer and game developer from Perth, from Black Lab Games. Christy Dena, who's a writer and designer. And we've got Glen Spoors on the end, a writer and designer and teacher, as well as Christy teaches as well. So basically, I'd like to sort of start at the beginning. Maybe, Alan, you could kind of tell us a little bit about the work that you do and kind of give yourself a bit of an introduction to the audience.
Do I have a few minutes? Or?
Go for it. I'll wind you up. I'll play the music if you go too long. Yeah.
So, my name is Alan Butler. I'm from Dublin in Ireland. And my job is usually defined as a visual artist. So I'm making images and objects and moving image works for galleries and museums. So I guess narratives in my work aren't necessarily linear or textual, but I've been working a lot on projects that examine the ontology of objects inside video game worlds.
So what sort of projects do you work on?
Yeah, so that's the good question. So the projects I'm looking at, there's an example of it in 2 rooms down. It's called On Exactitude in Science. It's in the Goldsworthy room, and the installation is composed of 2 screens. One features a 1983 film called Koyaanisqatsi, which is a film directed by Godfrey Reggio, which points the camera at planet Earth at the end of the 20th century in late capitalism. And on the other side, I've entirely remade the film, 86 minutes of it, shot for shot inside the video game series Grand Theft Auto.
Anthony, would you be able to just tell us a little bit about what you do?
Nothing's fancy as that. I just like to make spaceships blow up and make people cry. No, I am the writer and lead designer at Black Lab Games. We are currently working on Battlestar Galactica Deadlock, which is based on the TV show from 2004. And yeah, I pretty much spend most of my day either trying to make players happy through gameplay or make players cry through story. That's pretty much my deal.
Christy, how would you describe what you do?
Oh, that's how would I describe? Well, yeah, so I'm a writer, designer, director as well, but basically I'm interested in how you can write across media. How you can basically sort of, what happens when you're actually working on a project. So for instance, one of my projects that I'm designing and writing and designing at the moment is a short animated film and a companion local cooperative game. And it's how do you write across these as well? And that's one of my interests, as well as interactivity, and interactivity in all forms. I've got a performance background, theatre background, so live experiences as well as digital and app experiences there. And I'm really fascinated by the structural design of things, probably less so than dialogue. I guess because as I've moved further and further into designing my projects, I work more and more to the first person experience and to basically creating an environment in which the player is basically, taking on themselves in the world. And I often, create experiences where they're able to actually talk with each other, whether it be tabletop or whether it be in VR or something like that. So I'm more interested in the structures that facilitate that. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Glenn?
Yeah, I'm probably a bit of an odd duck. For me, I suppose when I was younger, I first wanted to do drawing and art, and then I wanted to do writing, and I wanted to do music, and I kind of got into games. And so games for me are just a happy convergence of different media. And so that's probably why I've found it such a pervasive in terms of my life since I kind of got back into games as an adult. In terms of, I suppose, career-wise, I ended up, because most parents always do, they say you can't make a career on things like this, so I kind of more into the academic stream. So I found that when I was younger, a lot of my self-esteem was based in what I made. And then I think my kind of maturation was more getting self-esteem elsewhere so that I could then re-engage creativity in a slightly more healthy, balanced way. I think that's probably most writers will find, that you're kind of wrestling with your own ego when you're writing. So trying to find some equanimity where you're engaging your writing from a more objective crafting point of view rather than just throwing your head like a charged paintbrush at a canvas and that's what you're left with. So I think for me that's been a large part of my journey, and games just so interesting because there's a convergence of so many things. And I think there's a genre, what's called encyclopedic fiction, which is, I won't go into it, but it's kind of fiction that ends up looking like an encyclopedia. So something like Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, or even through back to Ulysses or whatever, these massive narratives that strain under the seams. And I find that games are a little bit like that. They're kind of like a charged poem that they're just everything's crammed into, and they explode from their inability to manage themselves. So you like what you're talking about, structure that facilitates storytelling. I find that games have so much structure in them that they can't really contain an immersive world in the same way a lot of other media. And so I think a lot of it falls back into the literacy of an audience that kind of complete the process, which is a large part of immersive storytelling, like structures that allow them to immerse themselves safely. So yeah, in terms of how that applies to me, I suppose partly from a teaching point of view and supervising projects. At the moment, I'm working on a role-playing game, and that's probably been the longest thing that I'm interested at the moment. So more world building at the moment is what I'm particularly interested in. Otherwise, yeah.
So I think always really handy to start when you do a discussion like this is kind of to define what you mean by writing for an immersive media in your own perspective. Maybe we'll start from you, Glenn. What do you think about that when you're writing for an immersive or interactive media? What do you think about, and how do you define that?
I suppose still part of it for me is how selfish I am as a writer. So am I actually writing for an audience, or am I writing for myself? And I think in role-playing game writing communities, there is this, and even with players and kind of DMs, they just enjoy reading the books sometimes as much as they do playing them. So I think there's this really interesting tension for me that sometimes I enjoy just writing them and consuming them as much as in parallel playing them. And so playing them is that improvisational quality where you're writing by playing the game. So RPGs, for me, are a really interesting one where you're kind of taking several roles. Like sometimes you actively, say, writing a D&D system or a role-playing game system. Sometimes you're doing the actual world building. Other times you're just participating in someone else's world. Other times you're kind of engaging with a character. So for me, I suppose what's interesting at the moment is that when I'm playing the games, I'm often sort of drawing, which is part of the world building for my own game. And I bring characters from my own world into other people's fictions. So it's creating that... that kind of cross-system, cross-world creative collaboration, which for me I think is healthy because I often growing up tended to be quite insular and I'd close myself off from other influences. But I found that most productive writing and creativity came when I did expose myself to other people. So, that's one answer. Yeah.
Christy, what do you think? How would you define interactive writing?
Or how do I do it?
What does it mean to you?
How do I define it? What does it mean to me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what it means to me is, typically when you're, writing, you're taught to have a a transformational arc of the character, and basically, define that transformation. So for me, interactive writing is designing the transformation of the player. And that's the switch. Although the audience still transforms via, because it's a difference between, I guess, first-person transformation, but then there's a transformation via identification. Which can still take place, but I mean, I'm interested in both. But that's one of my fascinations with the interactivity is how do you design that transformation of the person, and in particular, consensually, like not forcing change on other people. I'm not talking about persuasion or coercion or anything like that, but basically how we can basically choose. We can basically say, I am interested in processing my grief, or I'm interested in understanding more about myself in this situation, and then engaging with a creative work that facilitates that reflection and understanding of yourself from there. So that's one of my interests with interactivity. Yeah.
Anthony, how do you define interactive writing?
Christy touched on like the big one for me, which is that like writing for interactive as opposed to a lot of other mediums is that shift in the perspective, shift in the point of view. And that's not to say that there, as Christy mentioned, like, there isn't, as if there's not a transformation of the audience in other mediums, but when you're dealing with interactive, what you're writing is no longer your story, but the player's story, and where's their agency? How are you enabling their agency? What's the context you're providing for their reason for interacting? I think that's super important. At least I personally feel like that is super important in like coming at this from the player's perspective. It doesn't matter how grandiose my plots, my characters are, if they're not talking to the player, if they're not making the player think, if the plots aren't involving the player, then I'm failing my job as an interactive writer. And I find that even on the current work that I'm doing with Battlestar Galactica, which is not branching, it's very linear, it's very prescribed, it's very plotted. But even then, like, if I forget to just have the characters go, we needed to go destroy that Cylon commander. If I miss that commander for too long, players notice it. And that's like a really, really basic version of what I'm saying. But like, it always comes back to how are you telling the player's story?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of how I interact with video games, I'm kind of trying to use them and try and find agency as a player to produce artwork inside the video games. So I'm kind of trying to go away from violence-driven narratives and explore the worlds in that way. And for me, I think like what's important to kind of realize at that point, like the most, I guess, expansive game worlds that I've seen and experienced are ones where ontologically the player has been thought out as much or in synchronicity with every single object in the world. So essentially, like, those writers have de-anthropocentrized the writing process. It's not necessarily a human-centered writing process. They're writing, what like a bag of potato chips is. How does that look? They're not just buying, a stock bag of potato chips 3D model off a website. They're kind of thinking about, well, in this world, what does this bag of potato chips look like? And that goes for everything to even, if you think of like a game like Fallout 4 or something, it's like, what do plants look like before the apocalypse and what do they look like after the apocalypse? And those kind of might be very slight details in terms of the petals and the grass and things like that. And those, like, it's kind of a maniacal task to think about, like, well, I don't have to write about, it's not just about writing this person's character and not just we're going over to the silo commander, but like what's on the way to the silo, and every single thing has to be considered at that level. And I presume this now involves like different like team levels of writers. So there'll be like the story writer, and then there's maybe a guiding principle document that secondary and tertiary writers then have to follow and say, well, what do shoes look like in this world, and all that kind of stuff. So the kind of de-anthropocentrized writing process is kind of a new, exciting kind of...
Sounds like you're talking more about sort of build the world out.
Yeah.
Is that more, am I on the right track there?
Yeah, but it has to be written, It's not like, when we were making films, that we would just bring a camera out into the world and we'd be able to buy a bunch of objects, and this is like social realism. You're not going to necessarily put a can of branded Coca-Cola in your video game. You're going to have to come up with and write a new type of soft drink, you know. So it's like everything has to be rewritten now, and it's kind of I guess like it's an insane task.
Well, there's a bit of a tension, though, between, on the one hand, there's the ambition of world building, which is to feel like you have to bloody-mindedly go through every single detail. But there's a writer ages ago, I remember, really called Mark Angino, and he came up with a concept called the absent paradigm. So, yeah, you know the example, probably, that, you know, he talks about an example of the door irised open, and in our world, doors don't iris open. So that means that the audience then has to mentally imagine a whole world, you know, a hyper-industrial system in which doors iris open. So often, if you know the ambit of the world and you just find objects that connote the world, like you can do the charity of allowing the audience to construct it themselves and not have to feel so hostage to the tiresome labour, because like RPGs, you know, there's so much world building.
Yeah.
That's quite a good point that kind of leads back to something that you mentioned earlier, where you were talking about having to build things within the rules of which players understand, and RPG players have a certain understanding of the world and how the mechanics of things work. But I'm curious if everyone can kind of talk about, when you're writing for an interactive media, you're probably going to have people who have different perspectives or even different context about how to play or how to experience an interactive piece of writing.
I mean, a simple example is the system I was working with. I first played with people, well, just like students, and they had no experience with role-playing games, and that was the best experience because they had no preconceptions. They weren't trying to play it like D&D. And then when I played it with the groups that I'd done D&D with, they were trying to play it like D&D, and they kind of sabotaged the purity of the experience so that I was trying to achieve. So that was kind of one example of that, I suppose.
Yeah, the tutorial design is one of the things that you iterate the most. You know, oh my gosh, and that's the thing. It's like we're creating this world in this environment. It's about that connection for where the player is right now, and everyone's different. And so the tutorial design is basically, you know, connecting all of those different people with this work, and you're not, of course, designing for every person on the planet. You know, that's not possible. But yeah, there's the mechanics of the actual interactions, but of course, it's setting up what they mean in the world, and because there's the player, just as in any form of art form, is basically going through their mind and positioning a story world and constructing, you know, how this world, what are the rules of this world and how it operates, and anticipating, you know, what will happen if you do certain things. And so that part of the journey is about setting up a really clear mental model, you know, for the player. And that's where a lot of the work happens. And yeah, it's not just the interactivity for me as well, because I'm interested in works that might be transformational for people. I also look at what's their context, what's the landscape, you know, is this a topic in an area that is well discussed, or is it new? Is it something that there is a lot of pushback about? And all of these factors are the things that influence how you actually move them through. Are they there by choice? Do they realize what this work is about? What's their genre expectations? And, you know, if I'm going to be transforming that. And so it's all there in that, in that part. Yeah.
And speaking about tutorials, someone who's done a hell of a job of narrative design in tutorials, and not necessarily to do with anything with story. Yesterday, my daughter bought Dreams, Media Molecule's new art creation tool for the PlayStation 4, and it's phenomenal. Like the amount of writing and just pure like text to screen writing involved in just the tutorial, which is both video and interactive tutorial, is phenomenal, because like they're essentially teaching an artistic language to kids as young as 8 years old. And that's I'm really glad you brought up the concept of tutorials as part of the interactive narrative design, because it is so important in setting up the context of how you introduce your players into it. But like giving them that language of interaction, giving them that language of agency, what can they do inside of the world? And yeah, I actually really recommend everyone check out Dreams just for their tutorials, even if you just find them online, because like whoever's written them has done an amazing job. Well, the entire team's done an amazing job of just these tutorials, setting them up in circumstances and concepts, in contexts, which are teaching people how to be creative and how to actually create 3D art and interactive 3D art inside of an engine, and it's still having just giving them complete understanding over what they're doing, of what their purpose and role is inside of that world. It's really, really cool.
I just want to add a method that I found really helpful for designing tutorials, and so I thought that might be helpful there. Stephen Cleary is a film development executive, film development consultant, and he's worked on like the Nina Simone documentary and things, lots of feature films, and he has a method that he calls the hierarchy of understanding, and basically he describes it as the things that when an audience is watching a film that they need to know in order for them to engage emotionally with the work. It's like, I need to know where I am in space and time, who the characters are in this. And obviously, it's basically, as artists, you can play with this, it's guidelines, but it's basically thinking about the audience and what they need to get to that point of emotional engagement, because if they're still trying to figure it out, then they're not emotionally engaged. And so he has these questions that you go through in terms of the hierarchy of the things that you need to understand before you get to that emotional point. And I've adapted it for interactivity there, and that's I've put it into a blog post. So yeah, you can search hierarchy of understanding. Christy Dena. Yeah.
Did you find that the interactive version was substantially larger than against linear?
Yeah, the thing that I found, because my litmus test is myself when I'm designing, working with clients and seeing if it works with them, but also playing lots of different things and saying, okay, does it work here? Does it capture everything? And the thing that I found, it wasn't necessarily the number, it was the fact that they radically change order.
Yeah, okay.
Which I found interesting. Whereas in the film, there wasn't much, change in the order of them. But with interactive projects, I found that it did radically. It's like, didn't matter as long as it's there and there. And one of the differences was, who am I? Who am I in this world? And what can I do? And those sorts of things are really critical. Yeah.
I mean, talking about tutorials opens up to just the whole concept of immersion itself, which I think sort of frames what we're talking about. And I think we're trained to think of, from Janet Murray, who wrote one of the most well-known books about sort of interactive writing a while back, she sort of talks about immersion is more like experience of like descending into water. And that kind of suggests that as you're immersing, you're going through stages, and that it's this kind of fragile thing you're trying to maintain to stave off suspension, a lack of suspension of disbelief. But I think the other image of submersion, especially in an Aussie environment, is just running and doing a bombie into the pool, which I think I think that on the one hand, immersion is subtle and fragile, and you do need a whole bunch of design principles as a writer. So for example, you're saying you're coming up with these principles you'd apply. And in my head, whenever you're doing any kind of design project, you'd say that, cool, you've got your universal design principles, then you've got your genre or your medium-specific design principles, then your genre design principles, and sort of kind of the principles you'll talk about would sit in kind of there, then your project-specific design principles. And so as a writer or a crafter of any form, you're trying to apply design principles as part of being a good artist, but at the same time, games and game audiences, they're really robust. So in role-playing games, there's a guy called Gary Fine who talks about the frames that you shift between as a role player. And so one would be that, if you start a role-playing session, you first rock up just as a player and you're just talking about what you've seen on TV and you're mucking about. Then you'll slowly kind of move into being a player. So you say, oh, where were we at last time? And there was another guy who kind of extended these frames and talks about a raconteur frame. And so the raconteur is, oh, what were we doing last week? And someone else takes on the role of storyteller of what we were doing last week. And then finally you get into, the stage where you're actually a character and talking about what your character does. And so the idea is that you're kind of descending deeper into immersion. But role-playing games and like computer games in general, you're jumping between so many different frames that these kind of rules do get broken. So, as a player, you'll kind of suddenly go up and order a pizza and then instantly jump back into the game. So you're doing the bombie back into creativity. So I find, there's this sensitivity that as a good designer, you should be applying design principles to create as coherent a world as possible. And for me, so that starts at, say, world building. So you start off thinking about the geography of the world, where do mountains form, where do rivers flow. Then from that, you start thinking about the ecology, you start thinking about the physiology of species, how their needs being met, then the sociology of how that world maintains consistency. You're trying to make sure the mechanics all marry. But ultimately, when someone plays and they jump between like a battle and then a cutscene or embedded story, they're going to have these jarring shifts, but they'll deal with it. And so for me, a metaphor would be, say in cinema, you had a whole bunch of rules that you're meant to follow. So like the 180 rule, which meant that if someone was filming, you would always keep a conversation. You'd always keep the camera on this 180 arc, because if suddenly the camera went on this side, people's heads were swapping around. So they're saying, this is the standard of, that if I'm filming a conversation, I always stay on this side. And so cinema did that for a long time. But then there's a film called Breathless, like the French New Wave, and they just said, well, why? I mean, the audience isn't stupid. They'll figure it out. So, in that film, you have like a gun going off and someone falls in the other direction. And it's not like anyone falls off of their chair and out of the film. They figure it out. And so game players are similarly quite robust. So, you're kind of accommodating the fact that players will deal with fractures in the narrative. And that's probably one thing I'm particularly interested in, and that was more from a research point of view, though, the fact that game players, and what's unique about games is that it's quite a fractured experience. Like you're alternating between like a fictional immersion and an immersion with the artifact, and often we're quite aware of what's happening with the artifact. So I suppose that'd be one thing I'd be interested in what you do with like the way you structure experiences, is that when a player is kind of kicked out of the fiction, in what ways you manage to kind of bring them back in, or how they respond to fractures in the fiction. So thinking back on other transmedia narratives, that you can't plan for everything, and there might always be a moment where a character finds a flaw in your narrative design. And so, I don't know if that leads on to the kind of ways that you structure games to accommodate when they've lost the structure, they've lost their immersion in the structure, and how you bring them back in.
Yeah, I mean, I use the principle of a recap. Yeah, it's basically, in television, you've got episodic design, and the design problem was, what happens if they haven't seen the last episode, and what do you do? And so they just resolve that with a recap, but they also have different episodic structures. So you've got I'll just quickly mention this, but the series structure of like self-contained, begins and ends within that one work, and serial is like it's continuing over across it. And so the two design solutions to the problem was the recap, but also a hybrid. Things that are continuing across to keep you coming back, but things that are also self-contained, so you feel as if you've got some satisfaction with that one thing. So I use those principles in there, but I call it a joiner, because basically it's like at the beginning you're putting in things that basically activate the mindset they were in before and remind them of where they were, and then you move into it. So
How does that physically manifest?
So the most recent examples that I've been doing that was actually for installations that went with films. So they were commissioned to work with a short film festival and create all of these installations around the films. And when people came out, if you're working with a feature film, it's pretty straightforward. The installation is related to the feature film. If you've got a whole lot of short films, it's like, how do you know which is with what? And so with some of them, for instance, there was an animated short film, and there were key colors, key illustrations, key moments, and that was a huge background. That was painted for that. So immediately it's like, oh yeah, that's that work, and the objects that were there. And in other points, it's props that were in key scenes that they suddenly recognise. And in other parts, it can be music as well. All of those sorts of moments.
I was going to say, I've got two other examples. One, which we're actually doing with Battlestar. Since we've started making more story content, like we've literally just stolen what they have on the TV show, which is previously on Battlestar Galactica. Right? And then we just do a recap of like all the major story beats. And that plays at the start of a campaign before the player jumps into the new storyline. And that works well enough for us because there's the nice little the niche there that we get to sit in. But there's the other version which I really, really appreciate, and we don't see it very often because it's quite to be honest, I actually don't know why we don't see it all that often, but for a lot of the lengthy narrative games, what I've really appreciated, especially in RPGs, is where you get the development team puts in a quick story recap of the previous quest that you've just done on the loading screen. And it's all just text, but it's just a quick little, which I think might be in Witcher 3. Maybe. Don't quote me on that. I'm not quite certain. But yeah, they'll just give a quick little recap of like, this is what you previously were doing in your last playthrough. Right. And it's just like a quick little paragraph, couple of paragraphs based on what you've done in the previous quest, and leading you up to when you load the game straight back into where you were.
Back into the save game.
Yeah.
That's nice. Yeah, there was a cross-media example of that in Canada. There was a TV series, Regenesis, and they created a parallel alternate reality game that went along with the TV series. And the recaps was a recap of what the players were doing, as well as what was happening in the series, which was really nice. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask about is, it sounds like when you build these systems, you build these rules. There is scope or a position there to break those rules. How do you break them while sort of respecting the player and where they come from? And can you?
Oh, do you mean rules of design?
Yeah, or even the rules of the narrative as well. Like, because you can have quite interesting developments in a story by breaking a rule of the world. Yep. How's the best way to do that?
Well, for me, it's a case of it's always the context. You're always designing to context. You're designing to the conditions that are there, and so I just see it as a toolkit rather than things that I have to do. As long as you understand why that rule is there, why it was introduced, and that's one of the things that I do when I teach game design. Is just like say these mechanics were introduced in a certain context for a certain reason. And as soon as you understand that basically why they were made and who made them, you can then have some understanding that you can actually design your own rules too. So it's a shift, I guess, a progression of the learn the rules to break them. It's like learn who made the rules, learn why they were made, and then, feel as if you can create them yourself.
Roll to move being a classic example of that, right? From board game design. Like, you look at board games from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and the concept of you roll a dice to see how far you can move that was prevalent. That's what was the standard design concept. And these days, like, it just doesn't jive because it introduces a whole lot of variability and unfair gameplay, which doesn't work on modern board games anymore. So exactly what Christy was saying, like, roll to move was a concept at a particular time in game design, which isn't applicable anymore.
Because there was the roll, but knuckle bones or the sticks or whatever. But they would thought that if you did well, it's because you were divinely favoured.
It's interesting. I was doing a workshop on video game agency at a university in London a couple of weeks ago, and one of the really interesting games that came up that people were looking at was this game called The Stanley Parable, which is a lovely game where you end up in an office and everyone's disappeared in the office and you have to walk around and find out essentially what's happened. You there's a narrator in the game that's kind of guiding you through the place, and at a certain point it tells you, why don't you go through the right door, and you can also you notice there's a left door and you can go through the left door, and then you think that you're kind of going around the opposite of what it wants you to do, but it always then has an answer for you, anything you do or interact with in the game. So your agency is completely predetermined, and what's amazing about it on a few levels is that absolutely every decision you make has already been kind of thought of first, and it kind of exposes the mechanics of these things. The storyline itself is a kind of reflexively a tutorial process itself from beginning to end, and there's these kind of things that I'm finding quite interesting in terms of there's new languages that can become the subject themselves, within those.
Well, I was going to ask you, it's actually quite interesting that you work in GTA, which obviously has a context, people know what that game is about, and then you are actually using that framework or that structure or those systems in order to tell a story in a different way. And why did you want to do that?
Well, I guess I'm my wider artistic practice. I'm interested in how people's kind of like where people's idea of simulation exists in society in the wider context. You know, we can see it in elections and our social interactions. And I started working with video games kind of metaphorically, you know, as these kind of, you know, systems were trapped in, you know. I wanted to see where agency was. You know, is it possible to have a bit like, you know, kind of the Stanley Parable itself is, you know, like, is it possible to have agency, and is there or like artistic autonomy possible in these corporate video game simulations? So it was kind of an experiment, you know, and it kind of oscillates between kind of accepting that, trying to pretend that the game world is a real environment, and what are the physical constraints I would have if I was an artist in that world, and then maybe trying to find out, well, what happens when the video game world intersects with our reality or other virtual realities like social media and things like that. So I think it becomes more interesting when, you know, like I'm adopting kind of pre-existing visual languages like cinema in the next room, but I've done like street photography, and I use, you know, a lot of 19th century photochemical process photography to document things in video games, and it's when that immaterial virtual reality stuff collides with kind of established media. I think the new narratives are exposed, because it's a familiar visual language in terms of what we know, but it's also we're kind of referencing, you know, characters or cities and landscapes in these virtual worlds that are fictional. And I guess I won't go into it now, but there are branches of new kind of philosophical thought that are very much beginning to try and bring into rational thought how fictions can exist as part of our realities.
I think it's a very interesting point you mentioned there, and actually to the Stanley Parable point that you were talking about as well earlier, where players will try to beat the game the easiest way possible and try to, how do you write around that? Stanley Parable does it in a really fascinating way. It seems to have anticipated just about every choice that anyone could possibly think of. But when you're creating something, what do you do to take on board that players are going to try and
actually what comes to mind is almost like, you know, when you're playing with a child, and the child sometimes doesn't really care that you're there or not. It's kind of, they just engage, and all you have to do is like shake a toy. And there's a little bit like when the person Facebook putting it, and it's like, I'm not really a player of this game, but I don't want to break their experience. So zeros, ones is like shaking the teddy bear, which I know it sounds condescending, but it's like, that was the position I was unwittingly trying to help someone else's play that I wasn't part of or actually immersed in. And that was like a very risky moment where I sort of maybe did okay. But
Yeah, so that relates to an early lesson for me, which is when the actors, because when you're creating immersive projects, sometimes you're using improv actors to, you know, to perform in it, and in that way you were, and they can break it, you know, as you did there. And I found that one of my first alternate reality games. So these are ones that are set in the real world, and I designed the narrative structure. So there was just different teams. This is for the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, and there were these different teams, and every single one of the narrative strands was just an experiment, was basically revealed evidence of a different murderer. So they were trying to find the murderer, and basically I designed it so all of them had a different murderer, and then put them together and see what happens. But I designed it so it was pretty even in terms of that. But then there was an actor who was improving, and their improv just basically sent everyone into their direction. So that equal narrative, you know, balancing was gone, and that's when I realised that how you can't have you need to train your actors into what are the boundaries. You have the discussions about what the boundaries are, but of course they need to be able to just play and do anything. So it's basically a plot agnostic moments where it doesn't matter what they're doing. It's more of an emotive connection and other things as opposed to a strict plot point that they're involved in. Yeah. Sort of.
I suppose there's something nurturing about that, though. The issue is that you might break it in attempting to support it, but if they recognise that you're trying to support the immersion, then you're fulfilling the contract, and therefore you don't have to be super precious about it as long as you're, like, from a designer's point of view, you're trying to follow the design principles, you're trying to cultivate immersion.
Yeah.
But if it does break and they show that you're trying to cultivate it, at least that's that safe environment for it.
Oh yeah, but I'm just saying, like, create an environment where it probably won't break, in that sort of thing. But yeah, like playtesting, that's how you basically put it in players' hands and say, where are you going to take it? One of the things that I love doing with playtesting now is, usually with playtesting. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on playtesting there. Is with playtesting is like you have a prototype, an intended thing, and you're interested in people's response to your work. You want them to play it the way you intended, to see if they're actually playing it properly. You're hoping, yeah. But this is where I decided to actually lean into it. And so I also run what I just call playful playtesting, where I basically say, your goal is to basically have the experience that you want. So if that means changing the rules and breaking things as you go, you keep doing it. And it's a lesson that I learned from Bernie de Koven, who has since passed, but he has an excellent book called The Well-Played Game. And in that, he talks about how when people are really immersed, that's the point where you basically go, oh no, don't worry, about that time or limit or whatever. Take as long as you want, because people want to stay in that state, and that's that key state you want. And so basically, I play test and I say, do whatever you feel like doing, and then they come up with great design ideas. Yeah. It's like, oh, thank you. It's pretty, yeah.
Alan, I want to know about player perspective in the works that you create. How is the player perspective? Are you the player in what you create, or is this experiences that people will be able to?
Yeah, I'm the player, I guess. Like in terms of this idea about like breaking the rules, it is essentially what my practice is in video games. So I guess modding games is like the ultimate way to break the rules. I'm always kind of thinking about this idea. Does anyone remember in probably like the late 90s, there was like these emails going around telling funny stories, chain emails, and there was one about someone who rang up the Dell hotline to complain that their coffee cup holder was broken in the computer. So what you're talking about is the CD-ROM drive. And I like to use games like that person used the CD-ROM drive. So the way to beat the Stanley Parable, which you're trying to, it's always going to prove that it knows what you're about to do, that you don't have agency, even to the point that there's one moment where you can actually jump out a window and fall to your death, but then it punishes you for that and makes you wait 10 minutes in nothingness and limbo land to do that. So every decision you make in that world is predetermined. So the way I would go into that is then, take the installation folder and hack out all of the files and see what I can find in the file structure. And one of the things I would do is produce cyanotypes. So cyanotypes are a 19th century photographic process made famous by a botanist in Britain called Anna Atkins. And she was making these photographic impressions of algae from the British Isles about 3 years after photography was invented. And she kind of popularized the photographic process so much that amongst British upper middle class housewives, that a few species of algae went extinct. So it was like a really popular kind of pastime to do. And in this vein, I've been exploring video game worlds, and the way to beat the Stanley Parable, I feel, is there's some plants in the offices which I've hacked into the file structure of the game, and I've extracted these plant textures out, and I print them on large transparencies in my studio, and I expose them through real sunlight in the original 19th century photochemical process to produce these images that are kind of a quasi JPEG plant, quasi sun photochemical process. And this is where you can begin to find agency within these things. So this is just like me doing something weird in my studio, but there are communities which are really interesting. There's one called the Irish Emergency Services Roleplay Community, where this guy has spent tens of thousands of euros modding Grand Theft Auto 5 to have the Irish police services, so all the uniforms, all of the different cars, the ambulance, the fire services, all this kind of stuff. And it's on a private server every Sunday. A bunch of guys meet up in this world, and they just perform police duties, Irish police duties. So they're not even, like, our police don't have guns, so they're pulling cars over. They modded the game so they can pull people over and do all this stuff. But there's real police in this, and there's one guy who got into it so much over the last couple of years, he's now going to become a real police officer. So it's almost like what you're talking about, this alternate reality principles are now being introduced into the video game world, where people can mod. And it's that kind of thing that I think would be really exciting, I presume, for video game designers to see, well, what are the users going to do with this if they smash it open and start playing around with the world. It's probably really exciting, flattering if someone did that, right?
Yeah, no, it is. It's really cool to see what players come up with, even if you don't go as far as modding, just in terms of, like, if you create a level and it's just a case of, like, you present them with, here's a level, here's some rules, here's a goal, how are you going to get there? And then they go ahead and just completely circumvent like 80% of your content because they find some unique way to get through. There's one particular mission we've got in Battlestar, which is you're supposed to be saving a particular escort ship, and I thought I had designed that level to be it's meant to be impossible to save them because the story is predicated on that escort ship being destroyed and everyone freaking out. That's the start of the long road down to everyone getting killed. Welcome to Battlestar. And we tested that mission for hours on end, just to make sure that there was no conceivable variation that you could do in your orders and your placements and all that this ship can be saved. And that mission's been out available for 6 months now, and I just got a Discord message on Friday before I left work that one of our most intense play testers came back to me and said, "Hey, I saved the president." It's like, yeah, so back to the drawing board on that one. But,
it's like that tested Star Trek. What's it called?
Oh, the Kobayashi. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'd like to open up to the floor. Has anyone got any questions at all? And I'll bring a microphone around so we can grab it.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm just wondering, I find narrative design, especially in digital games, really fascinating because, like, you have so much more choice than especially in film. Like, you can choose to have text or no text. You can have subtitles. You can have voice. Like, how do you approach narrative design? How do you approach how you're going to tell your story for different?
Someone else can go first.
That's a great question. It's one of those ones which it's kind of like a bit of a length of string question. Like, it can change. I think a lot of it purely depends on, like, what is the game you're actually trying to make. So what's the genre, what's the market, what's the platform? Like, you could have someone say, I'm going to make an RPG. It's epic RPG based on 3 warring kingdoms. And then the narrative design of that can drastically vary whether you're playing on a mobile or a console or PC. I always come back to what are the project parameters. So we're looking at platform, genre, budget, release date, how long we've actually got to make the thing. And then also who are the players. Because again, you take that example of the RPG of 3 Warring Kingdoms. That could be an action-heavy kind of RPG, almost like a Dynasty Warriors style gameplay element, or it could be a more exploratory, peaceful game like Yonder, right? And again, the way that I would handle the narrative design for those are very different because the player types are very different. So as well as the project parameters, come back to the player types. I'm very outdated that I still use my Bartle types, which for folks who aren't familiar with them, Richard Bartle was a MUD developer a multi-user dungeon developer back in the 80s, I think. Someone can correct me on that if I'm wrong. And he came up with a very a succinct definition types of players, the 4 player types. And it's worth checking out. A lot of people say it's outdated now. I still hold to it, to my chest because it's one of the few things I understand very well. But yeah, the player types also very definitively help me decide what my narrative design is going to look like. Am I going to be designing for a lot of action type experiences, in which case we can't have a lot of exposition, we can't have a lot of character heads on the screen, that kind of thing. Or are we going to be more political dialogue focused, in which case I'm going to be spending more time on my script writing and my rewriting, got to be sourcing actors. Like the actual casting itself is a massive task, which goes part of the narrative design as well. The level design, like all of those are purely informed by project parameters and player parameters, in my experience.
I guess, yeah, for me, in terms of like the choice about whether to communicate this via text or, whatever, yeah, it's trying as much as possible. I know it's a silly thing, but it's like the old adage of show, don't tell. And it's the principle in interactivity is don't show, do. To take it that step further. And so you might start off by imagining it in terms of telling it, and then you think about showing it, and then you think, how can this happen just by, the player doing something? And it's just, that doesn't always work. But yeah, that's your hierarchy: do, show, tell, in that regard. And you got hearing as well. Obviously, you got sound, but. And so those are actually critical for me. My mind just gone blank.
If you don't mind me jumping.
Yeah.
In terms of that do, don't show, like I found one game which was phenomenal. That was Thomas Was Alone by Mike Biddle, which is tells this incredibly emotional story about a bunch of jumping squares, and you will, if you haven't played it, you probably don't believe me, but you get emotionally attached to these little squares, these basic 2D shapes on the screen, and a lot of that just comes from the fact that the way you're interacting between these characters is not being said out loud. It's the way that you're actually switching between the characters and the way they're interacting, how they have that only some characters can get to certain places by utilizing the abilities of another character. It's all purely in the gameplay. It's great.
I remember now. My mind went blank for some reason. So one of the things is I'm always thinking about the world the player is constructing in their head, and so what are the things that either they're doing or they're seeing or hearing or whatever, which helps them interpret, what's actually going on and what they want to do. And there's really helpful information, theories related to that in terms of attention design, because that's one of the things you do in your designing. You're thinking about where you're directing the player's attention. And there's top-down attention design and bottom-up attention design. And so bottom-up is basically you're reacting, you're being led. There is a huge path ahead of you with a light at the end, right? It's basically saying, hey, I think I should be going that way. Top down is, you're actually thinking about, I want to get to the castle, or something like that. And an example I like to cite was actually from a study where there was a conflict of this happening, because a lot of designers often just think about the bottom up, just think about the visuals and don't think about how this can conflict in their head. There was a scene and a moment in which players had to get out of the room. They needed to get out. There was a door, there was a fireplace, I think there was a window as well, but there was a light on the wall. players tried the door, players tried the fireplace, players tried the window, but the designers wanted them to push on the wall and find a secret thing. And it's just like, that was, they were trying to force a bottom up with a top down sort of situation. And so, so it's always sort of thinking about what are getting that alignment with these two together in terms of what the player is thinking about. Yeah, that's critical.
That reminds me of it was one of those Hero Quest old adventure games, but it was, my cognitive process was trying to solve the problem of the lever, the rotating that I had to, it was like a mill and it had to stop. And so I was thinking, okay, to stop it, I'd need like a lever, and therefore what would be a lever? I'm in a farm area, so I'll go outside, I'll look for some farmers that have hose or some sort of implement. And so I was running around this village looking for the tool that I thought would serve to stop it. It's like top down, and then they just wanted me to press a button. So exactly the same thing to stop the lever.
And that's something, the figuring out what to do is one of the, that's like the crux of your narrative design, in that case. It's like that doing needs to be meaningful and have the theme. Everything needs a theme embedded in it, but that doing definitely. And that's one of the things, Michael, we were talking about this earlier, working on VR projects and, get called in as a consultant. And often the question is, we've got like one interaction or something like that. And the interaction often has absolutely no relationship with the theme at all. And so it's just a case of like, soaking in, what is this piece about? What is it saying? And what is that one interaction that basically, that when the player is doing it over time, they'll realize that interaction is actually part of the meaning. That's part of the realization.
What about games that don't do show or tell?
Have just do? What do you mean? How can you not have show? What do you mean?
There's a really interesting Irish artist called David O'Reilly who's made a game called Mountain. I don't know if you've come across it, where you're just a mountain. And it's like a kind of Zen way. Like you don't have to interact with it. It's more, it kind of precedes the do show, tell, and it just is. It's about is. And he's produced a larger scale version of this called Everything, which is...
I love Everything.
Yeah, and he's basically he built everything in the universe, and you can be a phone or a coffee cup or this room or hotel or Australia. You could be, like, he built the entire universe up to galaxy level down to quantum sort of thing. And if you leave the game, it just plays itself, and you are the universe experiencing itself, in a way. And it's maybe a type of narrative where it's like a non-human kind of just thing being, which is a kind of an interesting maybe potential for future games, I think, in terms of like where the non-human entities begin to take a bigger role in all of these.
But this is where thought is also doing, I think,
Well, I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. But just before we do, Christy, I know you definitely share a lot of resources, but I'm sure you're all keen to share resources and tips for people. Where can people find your work online if people want to find out more information?
Oh, me? Oh, yeah, ChristyDena.com.
Anthony, are you?
You can find my work with Black Lab Games at blacklabgames.com.au and my personal work at handwrittengames.com.
AlanButler.info.
And Glenn?
I suppose Lost Style Media is my current one, but I'm still updating stuff. So I still have some older stuff on The Wold. So if you search The Wold, Glen Spoors, or Lost Style Media, that's some of my stuff there.
Perfect. Well, we'll get a round of applause for all of our panelists here today.